The answer is we're out.
If working class voters won that referendum.
I think the country requires fresh leadership.
The new Prime Minister might be in number 10.
We just didn't know what was coming down the track.
Brexit means Brexit. I will resign as leader of the Conservative Party.
Boris Johnson is elected.
It's extraordinary the amount of big events that have happened in the time that you've been the political editor at the BBC.
Politics is not for the faint-hearted.
You must stay at home.
We've lost more than the population of a small city.
The vaccine is our way out.
This is far from over. In summer 2015, David Cameron was the Prime Minister, jubilant from an unexpected majority. The widespread conventional wisdom here in Westminster was that voters would choose to stay in the European Union. And as for Boris Johnson, well, he'd only just come back to the Commons as a backbench MP. And I became the BBC's political editor. No one could have guessed what would happen next. Jeremy Corbyn became the Labour leader. Vote Leave won the referendum. The Prime Minister quit, and it was Theresa May who moved into number 10. But she chucked away the Tories' majority at another general election. Parliament went crazy, locked night after night over Brexit. Mrs May was then forced out, and Boris Johnson won the day. There was another election that gave him a whopping majority, but that wasn't enough to protect him from what came next, a once-in-a-century pandemic that closed the country down. And now war in continental Europe. What's changed in 7 years? Just about everything. Expectations have been overturned. Politicians on the rise who wanted to break the rules. I've been talking to some of those who've been at the top of their game and caught up in what's gone on. Okay, right, we are running and we are good to go. Okay, yeah. So Nigel Farage, it has been an extraordinary period of disruption, change and all sorts of different voting events in this country. How different does the world look to you now since 2015?
It's a funny one because in 2015 we were mid the insurgency. We had UKIP coming up fast on the rails, winning a European election the year before, getting 4 million votes in a general election. Suddenly, the Labour Party can't believe what's happened to them. So you've got the UKIP insurgencies happening. You've got Jeremy Corbyn becoming leader of the Labour Party. So, you know, when you first started this job, it looked as though we'd entered a very radical phase of politics.
One of the things about this era and about when Jeremy Corbyn prospered was this sense that he was an outsider. We were in a kind of age of the outsiders, things outside the norm. To what extent do you think being an outsider was something that Jeremy Corbyn used, and was it deliberate?
It was a huge attraction because, remember, we were, after 5 years of austerity, people have had enough, you know, and they weren't just questioning what was happening day to day, they were questioning the whole system. So along comes Jeremy Corbyn saying, actually, I'll tell you why the system doesn't work. And it wasn't there's no spin. The issue with Jeremy, as compared with other candidates for the Labour leadership, is he just told it straight.
Why do you think it took the Labour establishment so much by surprise that someone who'd been, you know, a serial rebel who'd been on the outside of the party ended up at the top? Because it was such a shock to the party's establishment. Because
they were part of the establishment. That's why. And they didn't envisage radical change.
Could you believe it when he won?
No, I still... we had a group of young people who, from the start, were working on social media for us, and they were coming to me every week as the chair of the campaign and giving me the figures, and I said, you've got these wrong, go and retest them again. And they kept coming up with, Jeremy's going to win between 55 and 60% of the vote. And we had all these young people flood into the campaign with ideas and techniques I'd never even heard of. And I said, well, let's try it. And it was all social media, Twitter, and you name it, you know, Facebook in particular. Targeting, they knew how to target. Games. We set up a group called Games for the Many, and they invented games that people could play that would lead them into a political debate and support for Jeremy.
There she is. So, Nicola Sturgeon, so much has changed since 2015. One of those things, we're now talking to each other on Zoom, being able to do an interview like this. But you're one of the few constants in what's been a period of extraordinary change.
Absolutely, and you too, certainly for now.
Yeah, I mean, it has been. I think we'll look back on these last few years as the most eventful and actually the most consequential in our lifetimes. You know, when you think about what has changed, you quickly realise that it would be a much easier task to answer the question, what hasn't changed in those years?
Technology has changed politics hugely. I mean, I would not have been a household name without YouTube. There's no question about that. I mean, what I was doing in the European Parliament, which in the end seemed to make millions of people laugh, and humour's a good way of getting messages out. So, yeah, of course, all those things, all those, the means by which we conduct politics have changed.
I mean, in lots of ways, technology is a massive enabler. It's made lives easier for people, but it's made politics harder.
Yes, I would say it's certainly made politics harder in the sense of politicians are swamped with requests. So, you know, in 2010, I was probably dealing with 5,000 pieces of casework in a year. Now it's 20,000.
Remember that the founding benefit of social media is democratization of voice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it gives everybody
access,
the voice.
Everyone has access.
The problem is that it's made the voices, the shrill voices, more amplified.
The triumph of the outsiders was not yet complete.
We are approaching one of the biggest decisions this country will face in our lifetimes.
David Cameron had promised a vote on being in or out of the European Union.
This is one of the biggest political moments for years. He's finally confirmed you'll be asked the biggest political question in decades.
Red meat for the Eurosceptics in his party, but there were rather more of them than he'd bargained for.
Please join me in welcoming Vote Leaves.
His blonde rival plumped for the opposite camp.
The last thing I wanted was to go against David Cameron or the government.
This place, Westminster, assumed it was safely in the bag for the status quo. But Vote Leave ran an aggressive and provocative campaign.
The EU...
Nobody wants to listen to you.
And voters had other ideas.
Very, very early in the night, we keep saying it, but a senior figure in the Labour Party has just contacted me to say that they believe that Leave is actually going to win.
The British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.
The Brexiteers outmanoeuvred their establishment rivals, who couldn't quite believe what was happening. The shock of the result for them was followed by total political chaos for us all.
I happened to be on the Dimbleby BBC show that when he called it for leave for the BBC, and he just turned to me and it was like, oh, what was it, 4 o'clock in the morning?
Yeah,
or something?
I was on the other side of the table.
Exactly,
I remember.
exactly.
Yeah.
So he turns to me and says, "So how do you feel?" And I was like, "Yes!" like that. And he just sort of looked at me. And
Working class voters won that referendum. That was the big difference. And I think what the Vote Leave campaign did well with was Conservative voters in Surrey and Cheshire, the comfortable middle classes who maybe found Brexit difficult. Mm-hmm. And I think the influence of Johnson and Gove in areas like that was significant. But I think the real reason... Look at the Sunderland result.
Yeah.
A turnout we couldn't believe. And I've been to Sunderland 3 times since 2016. I met lots of people who said, I'd never voted in my life, or I'd last voted Labour in 2005 or whatever it was. So they were the kind of voters coming out because they really felt that vote mattered.
Is your deal facing defeat this evening, Prime Minister?
Theresa May was soon stuck. A yes-no referendum question had divided the country, and it split her party and Parliament in two as well.
I have just chaired a meeting of the Cabinet where we agreed that the government should call a general election.
She has changed her mind, and what happens next to Theresa May will be up to you.
But that proved a terrible mistake.
She had a majority of 17 when this election was called a few weeks back. She now doesn't have a majority at all. So from her point of view, it's a total disaster. It was a call she made and it fell flat.
So Theresa May walks back into number 10, still Prime Minister, but damaged, diminished, a smaller figure.
This is, I think, the worst example of ill-discipline in cabinet in British political history.
It felt at times almost like the country wasn't governable.
Yeah, and that is the hung parliament. I mean, whoever says in order to do politics, you have to be able to count. That is so true. I mean, once you're in a hung parliament, all bets are off. And I had the job of Leader of the Commons at the time, so with the responsibility for getting legislation through the House. Because we couldn't count on a majority on hardly anything, on anything, really. So you had to kind of hand-to-hand combat, go and ask nicely. So it did make for a really controversial and quite angry time. And yes, extraordinary to find in that hung parliament that I, as a cabinet minister, would be going through a different lobby to other cabinet ministers. I mean, that is just extraordinary.
I was involved in all the negotiations with the Conservative front bench. It was intensive. It was intensive, almost unpredictable as well, because there were so many shifting sands and you were never sure exactly what the outcome would be, not just on the overall strategy, but hour by hour. And we'd go along to those meetings and we'd think, well, we're near to a rational position here, which maybe we could carry in the House and then take to the country if necessary. And at different times you'd think we're nearly there. And then the Tories would fall out in front of us and then you realise they could never deliver.
In front of you in the meeting?
Yeah, and also individual members of the Tory cabinet would throw things into the debate, which you think, well, where did that come from? And then I'd check privately with contacts behind the scenes in the Tory party, and I'd have private meetings with Philip Hammond and others as well. And I said, where did that come from? They said, you tell me. It was like that. And so at the end of the day, we then realised, actually, Theresa May couldn't deliver her own party.
Without a majority, the government's fortunes grew worse and worse.
The ayes to the right, 202. The noes to the left, 432.
The debates were savage. Parliament was out of control.
What are you playing at?
And turmoil became the new normal.
Leave, leave, leave.
And through it all, lurking, waiting, the MP for Uxbridge, former Mayor of London, Foreign Secretary before he quit, and the man who wanted to be world king when a child, Boris Johnson, working out how to run as leader when his moment came.
I give notice that Boris Johnson is elected as the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party.
A victory for a man whose political career has been down on
will ever experience in the future. It was very scary for the public. It was scary for those of us who were in positions of leadership. The magnitude of the decisions closing down the country, which we effectively did overnight. The night, it was a Friday, that we decided to ask pubs to close. I remember travelling and I was passing pub after pub, closing their doors and pulling their shutters down. And it was incredible, just such an eerie, unsettling feeling. I'm not sure I've properly processed all of that yet. I haven't really had the time or space to do it. But there's no doubt it has made me reassess, not just as a human being, but as a leader, reassess priorities.
In early January 2021, when the second full-blown national lockdown was announced, before the numbers turned, when they were just going up, but they carried on going up exponentially, and you knew you'd done everything. They were the hardest periods for me because they were the periods when we didn't know if we were going to have an absolute catastrophe that overwhelmed the NHS. And thankfully, the NHS was never overwhelmed. So that was the hardest period because you knew that there was nothing more you could do.
In what ways do you think the country's changed?
Well, firstly, people are more engaged in politics and how decisions are made. I think people are more discerning between what matters and what doesn't in politics.
Does the UK feel like a stable place to you now, after everything we've been through?
Given my politics, you would possibly, and my sort of desire to see Scotland independent, you may think I should say I don't want it to be, but not in that sense, obviously. No, it doesn't. I think, Brexit, and one of the ironies, I think, of everything else that's happened over the past, 2 or 3 years is that the really big consequences of Brexit, the big implications of Brexit that are being felt and experienced right now have been obscured a bit because obviously the pandemic.
The one extraordinary point of stability through this whole period is that the Conservatives have been in office. To have reinvented in office at this pace has been extraordinary news.
And also having an awful lot of family arguments while you're at it. I mean, there's some hugely dark days for the Tory party.
I've got on my wall 4 pictures of 4 different cabinets that I was in. The David Cameron coalition cabinet, the Cameron post-2015 majority government cabinet, the Theresa May cabinet, and the Boris Johnson cabinet. And there's hardly any people who are in all 4.
And all that turmoil has come with an ugly side effect. All too often, there has been poison dripping through our politics. What politicians call each other, how some of the public have come to look at them.
What should have been a big battle of ideas came with brutal political fights, online and sometimes in real life too. Nastiness in politics didn't start with Brexit, but the agony over a 21st century divide made it ugly and much, much worse.
We'd kind of got to that 2010 moment that I mentioned earlier, where the leaders of Lib Dem, Labour and Conservative were just all so similar. So similar, and always playing the safe game. Always say, well, I mustn't say that in case I get criticism, as opposed to the kind of politician that says, if I say that and get criticism, I've got a chance here of getting a public debate going.
And getting a hearing.
Absolutely.
Are you suggesting sometimes politicians try to say controversial things to get a debate going? No.
I had a deliberate technique with this, that I'd say something like to my guys in the office and girls, and I'd say, right, I'm going to go and say this at this press conference. I know exactly what the reaction's going to be. There'll be howls of indignation. There'll be demands that I apologise. And what I'll do tomorrow is double down.
People were livid. I had friends and family who wouldn't speak to me, and
really?
that's sort of ended now. But certainly family members had very good friends saying to them, how dare you, your daughter, your son's wife, blah, blah, blah. People saying, how dare you be at all associated with that woman. And so yeah, I mean, it really was very, very emotional.
Is politics nastier then? No.
Definitely. Oh, yes, much nastier. Yeah. I mean, you wouldn't allow on air just some of the emails I've had in the last few days. I mean, it is completely vile. I particularly think for women, it's put a lot of women off going into politics. They worry for their families and just, don't feel that they want or need to take that kind of abuse. And abuse it very much is. And, you get it too, don't you? A lot.
Social media has changed the tone and the tenor of political discourse and public discourse. It's a much, much tougher place. And I don't mean that just in terms of scrutiny. People like me should be scrutinised, but for anybody really in public life right now, it's a much, much more toxic atmosphere.
I just remind people, it was pretty heavy in the past as well. In the 1980s, I had my windows smashed. I had a bottle broken into my child's sandpit. I had death threats. I even had, on one occasion, all the wheel nuts on my car loosened so that a wheel might come up if I went at speed. So it was pretty heavy then. But in terms of the common nastiness, yeah, people feel they can say on social media what they can't say to your face. But you just have to handle that. And actually, It's interesting. That sort of thing has become so boring that people are just moving beyond it.
Do you think so? Do you think it's on the way out, perhaps?
I think it's lessening in the sense of people thinking, well, you're just a troll, move on.
It's been an age of toxicity, of technology, of huge political turmoil. Stability has gone out of fashion in the last 7 years. Relying on conventional wisdom has become a fool's game. Listening and watching a smarter bet than trying to predict what might come next.
So would you like to see more disruption?
Oh yes, look,
Yeah.
I'm pretty contemptuous of our ruling classes. I really am.
I think a period of politics without any referendums would be a very good thing.
This is the time when people want change, and therefore those politicians offering radical change may well be listened to again.
I contemplate life beyond politics, and I'm like, I can't imagine it.
Reignite politics again. It's important for people like me just to focus on how we navigate to better, brighter times.